Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar on implementing context-sensitive design. My name is Heather Zuccaro. I'm a program manager here at the National Complete Streets Coalition, a program of Smart Growth America, and I'm here today just to moderate today's webinar and take questions from all of you at the end. But really, I'm going to turn things over pretty quickly to our presenters. We're joined today by our partners from ITE and Nelson Nygaard to discuss new guidance produced by ITE about how to implement context-sensitive projects on multimodal thoroughfares. This webinar is the latest in our monthly series, Implementation and Equity 201, The Path Forward to Complete Streets. Thank you again for joining us today, and without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Stephen Lavrenz from ITE. Dr. Lavrenz is an assistant professor at Wayne State University in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He conducts research in cyber-physical systems, specifically exploring the impact of new types of transportation technologies and sensing systems on roadway safety, operations, and community health. Prior to coming to Wayne State University, Dr. Lavrenz also works for the Institute for Transportation Engineers based in Washington, D.C., where he was responsible for leading the development of key technical resources, including the Context-Sensitive Design Implementation Guide that we'll discuss today, focused on complete streets and active transportation safety and mobility. Dr. Lavrenz received BS and MS degrees in civil engineering from Iowa State University, as well as a PhD in civil engineering from Purdue University. We're really lucky to have him here today to provide a brief introduction to this guidance. Dr. Lavrenz?
Okay, thanks, Heather. Yeah, so like Heather said, there's a little bit of a shift in the not too long ago past where I was with ITE and now I'm at Wayne State University. But while at ITE, I had the good fortune to be able to work with Paul and the rest of the team at Nelson Nygaard on the implementation guide that we're going to talk about today. But before Paul gets into the salient details of the publication, to give you a little bit of background and context, no pun intended, on where this all came from. So all the way back in 2010, ITE published a recommended practice called Designing Walkable Urban Thoroughfares, a Context-Sensitive Approach. This was a really joint, groundbreaking effort, not only in terms of the content, but also in terms of the partners involved. So this was Federal Highway Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Congress for the New Urbanism, alongside ITE, actively developing and contributing content to this. Like I said, this was a recommended practice, so there was a large emphasis on design, best practices, and recommended standards for design of complete streets and context-sensitive environmental solutions, but also, a focus on new ideas and needs. Back in 2010, the Complete Streets effort was pretty well underway. I think the profession as a whole was still relatively new to the idea of context-sensitive solutions in a large-scale context. So this recommended practice was one of the first efforts to coalesce all of the different practices and experiences from agencies around the country into one comprehensive set of guidance. Let me go to the next slide here. With that said, there were some limitations, understandably. So, just looking in terms of time frame, so 2010 versus 2017, which is when this most recent publication came out, worlds of difference in terms of understanding the impact of complete streets in context-sensitive design. So I definitely think, and I'm sure Paul will agree, that in 2017, 2018, transportation professionals and practitioners are generally much more comfortable with the basic concepts associated with complete streets and context-sensitive design than they were, 7 or 8 years ago. And so, on that basis, this more recent publication was really an opportunity to advance the state of the practice in these areas. An example of this, would be thinking about context-sensitive solutions in more of a network-level context, as opposed to a tactical or a project-level approach that was really the core underpinning of the 2010 RP. And again, Paul, I'm sure we'll get into some examples of this network level thinking within his presentation. Like with any design-oriented publication or recommended practice, the 2010 document, made it was a little bit more difficult to adapt the concepts in the 2010 RP to retrofit scenarios versus new construction. So, more so than ever, we understand that transportation professionals are applying many of the concepts around context-sensitive solutions and complete streets design to remake existing streetscapes. And they're often encountering process and policy-related challenges outside of the sheer technical feasibility of the solutions that were touched on by the 2010 recommended practice. So there again is another need for a more relevant and comprehensive resource. And then finally, the past decade has seen great success in adoption of context-sensitive solutions in more of the denser urban areas and the downtown cores. That's not to say that there's not still work to do, but really the challenge of today and tomorrow for the transportation profession is getting these practices to grow beyond the core downtown areas, or the very high density urbanized locations, which generally comprise a pretty small percentage of the overall street network for a jurisdiction. And so looking at more of the low density urban and the suburban type environments, those types of environments generate a host of unique needs and considerations, which Paul will go into further detail on, but they also typically comprise the vast majority of the street network. And so this new guide that was published in 2017 really aims to focus some additional guidance in these types of contextual environments. So the publication itself, the full official name is Implementing Context-Sensitive Design on Multimodal Corridors, a Practitioner's Handbook. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but we really wanted to emphasize the implementation focus on this publication and how it speaks to some of the real-world environments and unique challenges, not only with the design side, but also some of the design and planning processes and policies that need to be considered outside of the traditional design context that this guide would try to speak to. So this publication, this was produced jointly by FHWA and ITE. So it's an ITE publication. We received some funding from the Federal Highway Administration to produce this publication. And then we had a number of other partners involved, which I'll touch on in a couple of slides. Like I said, with the emphasis more on implementation, this is an informational report, so it's different than a recommended practice. The recommended practice is all about introducing new concepts and new standards and best practices, whereas this, as an informational report, builds on the recommended practice by taking those concepts and taking those standards touched on in the 2010 RP and presenting practitioners likely scenarios that they may encounter in terms of implementing the practices and how to address some of those issues, not only from a design standpoint, but also the policy and process, like I mentioned. Some of the high-level project goals, obviously we wanted to make this user-friendly and approachable, wanted to have it graphically rich, and I think Paul and his team did an excellent job in interspersing graphics and streetscapes and those types of examples amongst the more text-heavy sections. I mentioned already we wanted to expand and enhance the content of the 2010 recommended practice, and then also attempt to work in elements of the more recent NACDO Urban Street Design Guide through a series of case studies that are present later on in the implementation guide. Demonstrating successful practical applications was perhaps the most important goal of this particular publication. And then, I mentioned the growth in our understanding of of complete streets and context-sensitive solutions over the last 7 to 8 years, and really we wanted to ensure that we were taking into account all of that growth and knowledge in terms of how the different modes interact with each other in a typical streetscape. So considering pedestrian needs, bicycle needs, and freight considerations were more of a new area, more of a growth area for this publication compared to the 2010 recommended practice. All of these modes need to work in concert with each other. We feel like we hit a very good balance of presenting the impacts and the trade-offs of prioritizing certain modes over others in different kinds of streetscape environments. In terms of the content development and review for this particular publication, so Paul and his team at Nelson Nygaard really did the heavy lift in terms of the creation of the technical content. Their team served as the technical editor for this publication. The Congress for the New Urbanism was again a key partner in this, and their organization did a great job of contributing a great deal of the content for the case studies that are present in one of the chapters. We worked really closely with FHWA's Office of Planning, Environment, and Realty, and then we had a host of subject matter experts from different organizations weighing in terms of reviewing intermediate draft content and really making sure that this struck the right balance of bringing together existing practices and then also trying to move the envelope forward a little bit in terms of making sure that we're speaking to the needs of tomorrow's context-sensitive solutions and complete streets needs. And this list on the right-hand side is just a sampling of the organizations that really provided some great feedback for this publication. I did notice one bullet point I forgot to put on this slide was NACTO. So the team at NACTO also provided some great input into this publication as well. So I wanted to take an opportunity to thank them for that. And then finally, in terms of the reception and feedback, this has been very well received so far by the practitioner community. So we launched this publication in November of last year, so just over a year ago. We did a big launch webinar around the guide. I'm sure you can still find that if you search on the ITE website and the Learning Hub on the ITE website. We also worked very closely with FHWA to disseminate and promote this to not only the state DOT contacts around the country that they had in their engineering and planning offices for the different state DOTs, but also the pedestrian and bicycle specialists that work in the different FHWA regional offices. So this has had a very large nationwide dispersal and dissemination. We've had over 700 copies of the handbook downloaded since the launch just over a year ago. So this is, we're pretty confident that this is in fairly wide circulation and is being used and looked at by agencies around the country. And then again, like I said, we've had very positive feedback. There was a lot of, I guess, some of the most positive feedback we've gotten is with the case studies section that we had for this publication. And one of the emphases that we placed on developing the case studies is that we wanted to only include mature case studies. So projects, streetscapes and design projects that had been completed, I believe at least 5 years previously was the cutoff. So no project, no case study that's in the implementation guide was newer than 5 years old at the time of publication. And the intent of that was to really demonstrate not just the theoretical benefits associated with context-sensitive design and bringing in the community input for safe and equitable street design, but actually being able to show, this is what actually happened, and even looking a few years beyond the project, maybe these were some of the additional benefits, some of the unintended positive impacts that in a couple of the case studies even led to additional investment or a larger than expected area of adoption for some of the principles based on some of the initial outcomes or the initial impacts that were experienced. as part of the streetscape redesigns. So this was a very exciting, fun, and unique project for me to get to work on, and we're grateful that Paul and his team really nailed this in terms of the content. With that, Heather, let me turn it over back to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Before I turn things over to our next speaker, I just want to remind everybody that we will have some time to take questions from the audience at the end of today's webinar. So if you have any questions for either of our presenters today, please feel free to type those in the chat box at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Next up, to provide a deeper dive into the new guidance, Paul Moore from Nelson Nygaard will present. Paul is involved in the oversight and management of major urban design, land use, and transportation planning and engineering projects. He has 30 years of experience in developing a wide variety of projects ranging from major transportation and transit planning to smaller area planning and redevelopment studies, as well as traffic engineering and design manuals and studies and livable transportation solutions. He has national experience with clients including Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Miami, Memphis, Albuquerque, Louisville, and Madison, among many others. Paul specializes in working with communities who want to use transportation spending as a tool to make broad community improvements. For this work, he's received awards from the American Society of Landscape Architects, the Atlanta Bicycle Coalition, and the Congress for the New Urbanism, among others. Paul has also spoken at a number of conferences and led workshops with communities around the country focused on transportation and its broad impacts for a number of organizations, including ITE and the National Complete Streets Coalition. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Heather. So, you heard Steve mention a little bit that part of the focus of this guide was looking at guidance for places that aren't as well covered in some of the other guides that you have available. So, for example, the NACTO guide provides really fantastic guidance for urban places and central cities, places that have density and a lot of things going on, a big mix of things, but the guidance for other more suburban kind of places is a little harder to find. There's really good stuff in the AASHTO Green Book if you know where to look for it. The problem is that book is really big, really thick, and finding those kinds of gems that you can use in these more suburban places is difficult for people who don't spend a lot of time with their heads in that book. This is important because these suburban places make up big parts even of our central cities. This is a list of cities and how people in those cities actually describe the area where they live. So you see some place like Houston or Dallas or San Diego, which are big cities, but 30 to 50% of which are made up of places that people describe as suburban, that have basically suburban form. Even in a very urban place like Los Angeles, where I live, you can see a lot of the greens that represent those more suburban forms that are part of what even planners in cities are working with. And we know that this is changing over time and transitioning. You can see this street in Des Moines, Iowa, the left side of which has transitioned to a very urban form from the kind of suburban driveway-heavy form that was there previously. And most of you are in cities that are undergoing these transitions in real time, and finding guidance to help with that is part of what we wanted to accomplish here. Part of what we did in the manual is broke down the design process into two basic phases. So if you take these basic design steps, you've got, and sorry for the little bit of font weirdness, but so these first activities are really pre-design activities, and we felt like it was important to pull these out because many of you who are in design know that the decisions that you make up front drive a lot of what occurs at the end, and oftentimes people aren't as engaged in these pre-design phases, but this really does make a big difference in how things turn out in the end. And so we did spend some time talking about those pre-design activities and the things that were important to think through. Obviously, some of the things that we know about that are important for cities, things that affect greenhouse gases and air quality, for example, are largely impacted by transportation decisions. The costs that individuals incur, this isn't the thing that we're always looking at. Sometimes we're just looking at the public cost of a project, but the cost to the individuals is an important consideration that should be a part of the pre-planning phases of projects. The recognition that the mere act of building roadways is going to induce travel and cause impacts downstream is important. And we know that planning without considering those things has gotten us the exact opposite of what we've said we wanted. So it's getting us more vehicle miles of travel, longer commute times, less transit ridership, generally the opposite of what most communities are saying they want to achieve with transportation. We have the health impacts from less active lifestyles. And so we wanted to go into some of those pre-design decisions that do affect those outcomes and should have a wider group of engagement. One of those is the traffic growth rate that's assumed. It's pretty common to just say, well, let's assume that car traffic is going to grow 1% or 2%. Sometimes that doesn't match up to what's really been happening. These are diagrams of traffic growth in Midtown Atlanta over a 10-year or so period, and you can see most of these show flat or even declining traffic volumes over that time period, whereas it was generally the policy to assume that there'd be growth of traffic in the future. So having a bit of a backwards look to check that forward look can be important. This is magnified depending on what sort of planning horizon that you look at. If you do assume some traffic growth rate and do it over a 20 or even 30-year period, you get that magical compound interest effect. The idea that a small growth rate compounded over a long period of time ends up doubling your traffic over a 20-year period and effectively precluding anything that's not automobile-based in terms of decision making, which isn't the flexibility that most cities are looking for as they talk about trade-offs and how they use space. And then finally, spending some time talking about what success for a community would look like. Focusing solely on traffic level of service, as we've done for a lot of time. A diagram like this may please the traffic engineers who want this level of service A, but the same street at level of service F actually represents a real success for economic development and probably urban design and lots of other measures. A couple of the strategies that we talk about in the guide. One is actually getting out and taking a look at what you're looking at. This is a bus stop study in New Jersey, and the data didn't really tell you what the issues that people were talking about here. The bottom right, you can actually see what part of the problem with this location was, which was you were asking people to stand and wait for the bus in a gas station parking lot. So some things don't pop from the numbers. Some things have to be observed. Another strategy is actually letting your data cross-check. A lot of Vision Zero programs do a really great job of taking data that we have plenty of in most places, crash data, and cross-checking with other social factors like poverty and transit ridership and things that we know are interrelated, and using those data to cross-check can help daylight a lot of community goals and potentially drive towards different solutions than just singularly focused automobile metrics can. And then lastly, thinking a little bit longer term, and this is becoming even more important as technology is changing most of what we do, but thinking about who we're planning for, whether that's an aging population or a younger population whose behaviors are different than what we've seen in the past, such as the lower rates of driver's licensing among younger people. Being realistic about funding, just recognizing that the days of 80% federal matches are probably gone and that we have to be smarter about infrastructure dollars to make them stretch further and manage the infrastructure that we already have. And then understanding that as technology changes, we just need to be prepared and be nimble. We don't know exactly what's coming or when it's coming, but understanding that as people more and more use their devices as a way to navigate mobility, the curb space is really going to be the new frontier, whether you're thinking about scooters or autonomous and shared vehicles that are dropping off. Having some triggers and flexibility built in around how this curb space is managed is going to be as critical for cities going forward as thinking about car movement may have been in the past. We broke the technical chapters of the manual into areas and ideas that we felt like were more in line with what practitioners were needing. So, in other words, getting a question from elected officials or a partner agency about how you're going to accommodate the new regional transit plan on your streets might be one question that you get. Or how do we deal with speeding on this road? Or a pedestrian has gotten hurt crossing this street. What can we do about it? So we tried to break these chapters up around those questions. The first of those, as you heard Steve allude to, is around these kinds of modal networks, transit, walking, biking, and how that integrates into street design. A lot of this, as most of you probably know, is about trade-offs. There's not enough street right-of-way to do all of the things that we'd like it to do. And a lot of these things actually compete with each other. This is going to be really messed up and hard to look at, but this is just a chart that talks about things that the different modes need and that they want, and that sometimes these are in conflict. So pedestrian safety is a need, automobile speed is a want, but those things are entirely in conflict, and so we have to think through the wants and the needs of the different modes as we plan the space that they're going to be sharing. There are a few sort of primary trade-off drivers that we talked about. One is mobility function, one is modal emphasis, and one is context. So I'll just walk through a bit of those. The mobility function, thinking about the function, the transportation function of the street, as you see here on the left, and the context that that street is serving, this is really how you define street typologies. And it's a bit broad to put it this way, but really the transportation function of the street by and large will drive what's happening between the curbs. So things like how you're assigning the lanes, whether you have parking, whether you have protected bike facilities, those sorts of things are a function of the transportation systems that you're trying to serve. And the context, or really specifically the density and the ground floor land use, very much drives what's happening behind the curbs. So having an understanding of both of these things is a really key part of how you start to put things together. Understanding that mobility function. This is a city street in Atlanta that might as well, the signs might as well tell you exactly what's supposed to happen on that street. That basically, if you're not in a car, you're probably not invited. Understanding how that mobility function and how the way that we design affects the mobility function becomes pretty critically important. Part of this is understanding the networks that you have overlaying in your systems. If you have a bike network, if you have a priority transit network, understanding those priorities in the street assignments. And I'll kind of move quickly through some of this, but part of this is understanding the things that make each of those systems work. So for transit, convenience, safety and comfort, reliability, and basic density and urban form are things that make transit work, and first mile, last mile. So understanding how those pieces can be part of a system and fit into the trade-offs when you do have a transit priority street is important. Likewise on biking systems, we know this guy will ride a bike almost no matter what, but how we get the rest of these folks to ride bikes is often critical when we know that a street we have is a priority for cyclists. So understanding comfort and behaviors and markets, and knowing that this really large group of people who are interested in riding bikes but are going to be looking for designs that are much more protected and separated from traffic is also key in weighing out the trade-offs when you're thinking about how these systems work together. So the manual tries to go a bit through how some of those trade-offs work, identifying context, understanding how that context is going to change over time, so that when we have a street like this, but we know that our community needs are such that they would support a street like this that supports functions beyond just moving an automobile. This is part of the case studies that you heard Steve talk about, and trying to demonstrate how these concepts are put into practice, in this case in the San Diego area. We go through a few strategies for completing out those flexible networks. So things like breaking down superblocks and adding street network that creates more car capacity while it creates a better and more balanced system for bikes and pedestrians and buses, reducing speeds to safe levels. Another strategy is looking for efficiency. The idea here that 3-lane streets, essentially 1 lane moving each direction with turn lanes, creates actually more car capacity and safe crossing environments for pedestrians. We talk about the actual carrying capacity of networks. This is Abercorn Street in Savannah, and downtown Abercorn Street is a 2-lane street that supports about 40,000 acres per square feet of density. And then as you move down and the sort of street gets widened and widened, you finally end up with this 7-lane street that's supporting about a quarter of the built density because the network has fallen apart and is so much less dense. So building in those networks is a big part of supporting multimodal systems. The second technical section talks about safety and walkability tools and processes. So if you do get that question about a pedestrian that's been hit and what kinds of tools that you have, this section talks about that. It's important in all of these. Sorry, this is not advancing. Sorry about that. I'm having a little technical difficulty advancing the slides. See if I can try it a different way. Sorry about the delay here. Heather or Natasha, do you have any ideas for me?
Oh, I can take over. Just let me know when you need me to advance to the next slide.
Sure. Okay. So the next slide, understanding speed is a really critical part on safety. A lot of you have probably seen some version of this slide, but as a pedestrian, your chances of surviving impact with a vehicle when that vehicle is going above 25 or 30 miles per hour goes down dramatically. Eric Dumbaugh did a lot of research too on the idea that narrower lanes and cues that give drivers information that tends to make them slow down tends to reduce crashes. This is different than the way people used to think. People used to think wider and quote-unquote forgiving lanes created more safety, and what a lot of this research suggests is that the narrower lanes and urban cues actually slow people down and create better safety. We talk about some common situations, the arterial transit corridor. You see this in a lot of edge suburban places where your really high transit ridership corridors tend to be on these state routes with long signal spacing and high vehicle speeds and really unsafe pedestrian crossing conditions. On the right you see the escape route. That's the idea that you often have these sort of downtown grids, but there's this bigger arterial on the edge that's maybe a one-way arterial that people are using almost like a freeway to get in and out of the city and creating unsafe crossing environments. This is MLK Boulevard in Baltimore. That's one of those escape route kinds of streets, and it's perceived as a really unsafe, really overbuilt street, but there's actually, and you can see some of the reasons, there's no crossing opportunities, it's out of scale. This is Michigan Avenue in Chicago, which is an even bigger street, 7 lanes, but it has vertical enclosure for pedestrians. It has a big sidewalk scale to go with the big street scale, lots of crossing opportunities every 300 feet, and activity that's driven by density. So making sure that things match up and fit can keep things balanced. Among the toolkit items that we have in there for pedestrian safety are some notions of when you would need actual active crosswalks, something like a signalized crosswalk as opposed to just painting a crosswalk as a function of volume and vehicle speeds and number of lanes crossed. We talk about the kinds of tools that you can use for these crossings in these different contexts. We have some discussion in there about setting priorities for when you would look at putting in protected pedestrian crossings based on the number of people you expect to use it, the type of risk that's involved. And then we also talk about some of the obstacles, the traffic signal warrants that are often used as an obstacle for putting in protected pedestrian crossings. there's actually a good bit of flexibility built into those warrants that people can use when they do have a case for a place that needs a safe pedestrian crossing, such as a transit stop that doesn't have a safe crossing anywhere nearby. And then we talk a bit about the legibility of crossing and how something like you see here in Greenville, South Carolina on the top right, that the pedestrian space reads straight through the street so that the cars understand that they're intruding on a pedestrian space rather than the opposite. And the last technical section is this idea of speed management. There's this myth that was created that because freeways in their early days particularly moved a lot of cars over greater distances, there's this myth that freeways are efficient, but we know they're only good at certain things. They break down a couple of times a day. When things gather at the interchanges, that doesn't work as well. They also haven't done a great job reducing congestion. The places that have built more freeways have had more congestion. So one of the things that we try to do is really separate the notion of speed and capacity. They're two different things, and as we talked about previously, lower speeds can be safe for mixed modal environments and can still move a lot of capacity. There's a lot of good guidance for how you reduce speed on neighborhood streets. This is from NACTO, and lots of cities have traffic calming programs that are great for local neighborhood streets or maybe even sometimes collector streets. But on the arterial streets, it's tougher to find guidance. A lot of these tools aren't the right tools for bigger arterial streets. So part of what's it's important to understand is that the flexibility that we have around lane widths or number of lanes are perfectly fine and reasonable to employ. All of the cars fit within any of the acceptable ranges of lanes, and so we do have flexibility in how we design bigger streets. This is a street in Atlanta that the community wanted to reduce speeds along. They took 6 lanes and reduced it to 5, and when they reduced it to 5 lanes, you can see they put some fairly constrained dimensions there with the intention of slowing down cars, and actually succeeded at slowing down cars here on Peachtree Street with the dimensions that you see there. So we get into a bit of what makes drivers slow down on arterials. If you look at the Green Book suggests that you control driver speed through horizontal and vertical curvature, which is great if you're designing a street like this. You can put all the curvature in that you need to get people to choose the speed you want. But if this is the street that you're designing, that's sort of a limitless design speed. As fast as you can go is what that design speed is. And that's, on the right, is a lot of what we work with in cities. Enforcement will probably only get you so far. So really thinking about how people make speed decisions becomes really important. And this is what people do in an instant. They do a risk-reward analysis in their brain. The risks are looking at the type of speed. They think about the weather. They think about whether pedestrians or bikes are likely to be here. They process how much of their environment they can see based on trees or buildings that constrain their view shed. And they make a decision that's weighed against travel time. They want to get from A to B as fast as possible. We do this calculus immediately in our brains based on our built-up experience. One of the reasons teenagers are terrible drivers is they haven't built up this database yet to make these decisions properly. But understanding that means that we can change design elements that tend to change those cues for people about those risk factors. And so those factors are the number of lanes, the lane width, the edge activity, and the vertical elements. So in terms of number of lanes, a lot of you have probably seen this, but on 4-lane streets, basically the most aggressive driver can weave in and out of traffic and really set the speed on the street. When you reduce that to a 3-lane street, not only do you create a safer environment in terms of visibility, but the most conservative, slowest driver is really setting the speed for the street. And when they've done before and after studies, this is Edgewater Drive in Orlando, they've seen reduced crashes on these streets, reduced injuries, and reduced speeds before and after. So really reducing streets to 1 lane moving in each direction has a tremendous impact on reduction in speed and on safety. Getting these to work the data that's emerging suggests that they really work best when the trade-off of vehicle capacity is not severe. So this is a lane reassignment in Minneapolis, and in the 75 to 100 range, you see the congestion and heavy congestion kind of areas in terms of the volume capacity ratio. If the change that you're making adds congestion but doesn't put it into those pink and red zones, those are the projects in most places that tend to stick. Those trade-offs seem to be accepted by the community as good trade-offs and things that are supporting livability without a really, really big downside. We talk about lane width adjustment. This is a pilot project in Dallas that lanes were reduced down to 10 feet and between 2 and 7 mile per hour difference were observed. Same number of lanes moving, but just reducing the lane widths reduced the speed. And thinking about both of those strategies, it's also important to know your audience. So, oftentimes these 4 to 3 road reductions, the outcome is to get a pair of bike lanes at the edge of the street, which is great, but it may not be what every community is looking for as a primary objective. It may, in a lot of cases, it's better to emphasize the speeding and pedestrian safety aspects. You still get the bike lanes, but making sure that the community understands the driver for the project becomes really important. Amenitizing the space that you repurpose in streets is another way for people to be able to see the community benefits, and doing this in a smart and varied way that speaks to community goals and to things that are important in an individual place becomes a really important part of getting these projects sold and getting them to stick once they move forward. So that's really quick and a bit of what we covered in the guideline, and I'll hand it back to Heather, and Steve and I would be happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Paul, thank you so much for that overview, and thank you, Steve and Paul, both of you, for taking the time to speak with us today. Just a reminder for those of you listening in, we're going to take some questions from the audience now. So if you have a question for either of our presenters, please type those in the chat box at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And I'll actually start by answering a question that we always get on these webinars, which is this webinar going to be recorded? Am I going to be able to get a copy of these slides? The answer to both of those questions is yes. We are recording this webinar now, and we'll publish a recap blog post sometime in the next week or so that will include the full recording of this webinar along with a PDF of the presentations, and if we get more questions than we get to today, we'll answer some of those there as well. So please stay tuned for that. And our first question, so Paul, you talked a little bit about some of the guidance on crossings, but one question that we received is, does the new context-sensitive handbook specifically cover the notion of complete intersections or general, recommendations for safe intersection redesigns? And I'll turn it to Paul and/or Steve to answer that.
Yes, this is Paul. I can start. I don't think we use the term complete intersections, but I suspect what you mean by that is covered in here. So we definitely talk about safe crossings for pedestrians, both in intersections and between what are typically thought of as intersections. We talk about considerations such as traffic signal cycles and the effect that has on convenience for pedestrians. In other words, if you have a 180-second cycle and you're standing there as a pedestrian for 3 minutes waiting, that isn't great. We talk about pedestrian visibility, crosswalk design, and then we do get into some tricky intersections. So ramp intersections at freeways, for example, or crossings of rail tracks and some of those kinds of ideas. So we do spend a fair amount of time in the chapter on pedestrian safety talking about intersections and the way that they can be made safer for all of the modes that use them.
Yeah, this is Steve. I'll just add to that. I mean, one thing that this guide did was not to rehash or reinvent every concept in other publications. So it does make pretty extensive reference to other resources in some of these areas. So I know to this question, for instance, there's a lot of references to the FHWA traffic calming e-primer, which has a lot of relevant treatments to make intersections safer for pedestrians and bicyclists. There's some references to the NACTO Urban Street Design Guide. I can tell you that one publication on the horizon that you'll want to pay attention to, there's actually an NCHRP project out right now. It's 3-133 on intersection design and operation for pedestrians and bicyclists for signalized intersections. It's a little bit more operations focused, but it gets into some of the same things that Paul's talking about with signal timing, leading pedestrian intervals, and a little bit of geometric design treatments that are also applicable. I think that's due out some point in 2019.
Our next question is, where does one download the publication?
So the publication itself, that's a good question, can be accessed through the ITE website. If you go to the ITE bookstore, and search for something like context-sensitive design or CSS, you should pull it up there. Last I checked, I know ITE members, it's free, and so that includes if your agency has a membership or anything like that. And I believe, I want to say it's $50 for non-members. Don't quote me on those numbers, but it's accessible through the ITE bookstore. And if you go to the FHWA website, the Office of Planning, Environment, and Realty, I believe they also have a link that goes back to the ITE bookstore if you're having trouble finding it.
Thanks. And we'll get a copy of that link as well and share it with those of you on the webinar today, as well as link it in our recap blog. Our next question is, over the course of preparing this guidance or looking at the case studies that you explored, looking at other guidance that you reference, do you say much about whether creating bus-only or bus priority curb lanes has an impact on not just transit travel time, but also on speed and crash rates?
So I guess the short answer is no. I personally, and Steve, you let me know if you've seen differently. I haven't seen any data on improvements to crash rates or vehicle or general vehicle speeds along corridors where lanes have been converted to either bus priority or bus only. I've certainly seen the data on improved transit travel times and improved transit ridership that communities have gotten from making those sorts of upgrades, but I haven't seen any data on differences in overall crash rates before and after those types of projects. I'd be interested if that info is out there, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, same for me.
Our next question is specifically about lighting. We've talked a little bit about the pedestrian-centric chapter, but does that portion of the guide or other pieces of it cover lighting design, specifically the kinds of lighting that are needed to make sure that crosswalks are safe and visible?
So the guide talks about traffic control lighting. In other words, flashing signals or beacons at pedestrian crossings, and it does talk a bit about preferred marking at pedestrian locations and crossings. To Steve's point, beyond those two things, it really does make reference to some of the deeper pedestrian guidance that's available from Federal Highway Administration and NACTO to get into some bigger design details around marking and lighting.
And our next question is, you both mentioned at various points in your presentation the mature case studies that you looked at, these projects that had been on the ground for at least 5 years. And Paul, I believe you showed some pictures and made mention of a few of them specifically. We were curious to hear a little bit more about them. Could you give us an example of one of those case studies and what you learned from looking at it?
Steve, I can take this, or you can, wherever you got it.
I'll start with, we did, just counting them up right now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different case studies, I believe, in different locations around the country. I know one that sticks out in my mind, perhaps because of my current academic leanings, was the one that was done in Raleigh, North Carolina, and it was done, I can't remember if it was UNC or NC State, adjacent to that campus, but it took what was previously a 4-lane, I believe it was a 4-lane, it was signed 25 miles per hour, but I think travel speeds were in excess of 40 miles per hour. Really just your typical suburban type streetscape with a design speed that was grossly mismatched to the posted speed limit. And it was right adjacent to campus, so you can imagine there's tons of students trying to cross the street from nearby housing. Really set up some dangerous situations. And so what the North Carolina DOT and the city of Raleigh did, they went in and they redesigned it to more of that complete street type of an environment. So they they did some modification to the parking, they did some lane narrowing, they widened the sidewalks and added more space for pedestrians and bicyclists. And not only did they see an initial reduction in speeds and crashes, there was also an unexpected boost to the economic development in the area in terms of new businesses opening up as you made this area more bikeable and more walkable. And it was actually that economic development impact that prompted the NCDOT and the city of Raleigh to expand their initial planning in terms of where they were going to apply this streetscape template. They actually ended up implementing a whole additional phase of design and implementation based on some of the unintended positive impacts or the unplanned positive impacts associated with this project. So that's just one example of one that sticks out in my mind. Paul, if there's any others you want to touch on, though.
Yeah, I won't dive too deeply, but the case studies are a pretty good mix of I'd say sort of larger budget projects. So in Lancaster, California, and San Diego, California, they're pretty beautifully and strongly streetscaped redesign projects that cost some money. But then there's also one from Hamburg, New York, that's really just paint. So I think the case studies do a pretty good job of walking through that spectrum that is representative of the varying dollars that different communities may have to try to make some transformational changes.
Thank you both for those answers. Our next question is, I think, building off of a pair of slides that you showed, Paul, about how reducing the number of lanes can really have a pretty big impact on not just speed, but the way that drivers are able to weave along a road. But the question is, are there any specific examples of road diets or 5 to 3 lane reductions anywhere within the guidance?
Yeah, we definitely talk about the concept quite a bit, and I, again, as you saw, I showed some slides that talked about the things that are likely to occur from those lane reduction projects. I think I saw in the questions the question about whether there were any examples of 5-lane to 3-lane reductions. There definitely are a few of those that have occurred around the country. I'd have to look back at some of my data to recall a couple, the places that have done that. It tends, in my experience, those tend to be tricky because it's really only going to work when the traffic volumes are, are pretty low, in the 20,000 range, and communities that have widened out a road to 5 lanes on a road that's only, that's carrying less than 20,000 are often communities that haven't had the same sort of trade-off discussions historically. They sort of aren't as far down the road in making these trade-offs and these rebalancing projects. So it would have to be a pretty special set of circumstances for a 5 to 3 to work. But it has happened in a few places, and I think if those circumstances are right, a place that's looking for change, property owners and business owners that are supportive of the change, and traffic volumes that mean that the congestion that's created is not too severe. I think if those things line up, it's certainly worth looking at for a project.
So I apologize, just looking at our case studies, I can tell you the 2 California case studies, so Lancaster and San Diego, they didn't go from 5 to 3, they actually went from 5 all the way down to 2. And at least I know Lancaster, they turned that center area into more of a parking median so that they could move the parking off of the curb space to have more room for pedestrian and bicycle activity. So if you want some real-world examples of not necessarily to 3, but that idea of reducing from 5 lanes, at least a couple of the case studies in the handbook speak to that.
And with that, we are almost out of time. I want to take this opportunity to once again thank Dr. Lavrenz and Paul for being here today with us and taking the time to share all this great information about the new guidance available. As I mentioned, we'll follow up with a link to the guidance as well as a recording of the webinar and a PDF of the presentation, so stay tuned for that. And we will also be back in the new calendar year with future installments of our Implementation and Equity 201 webinar series. Thank you all again for being here today, and have a great rest of your days.
Thank you. Please stand by.